Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to this BAFTA Games live stream here from the Creative Assembly office in Horsham. My name is Leif Walter. I was a senior designer on Total War 3 Kingdoms, and I would like to welcome you to this talk or discussion called 1 plus 1 equals 3, a Total War 3 Kingdoms campaign balancing post-mortem. And what I want to do is talk about some lessons learned from the balancing process of Three Kingdoms, lessons that we've learned by looking back at the game and analyzing what worked really well and what might have not worked as well. Before we dive in, when people think or talk about balancing, they often think about, oh yeah, it's just number crunching and sort of getting the numbers right. But there's really much more to it. So for the purpose of this talk, I want to define balancing as in, yes, the numeric balancing, so the numerical values of the content, but also the balancing of the systemic interactions, so the system design as a whole. And finally, balancing as in achieving the game polish and sort of wrapping up and really polishing the game at the end of the project. In all of this, we're going to focus on the campaign part of Total War, and we'll in a second get into what that means. Just to give you a quick overview, so I'm first going to talk a bit about the game itself, about the campaign part of Total War 3 Kingdoms, and then delve into the lessons learned. There are 3 of them, and then wrap it up with some takeaways. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I might occasionally, after these sections, make a little break and look at these questions, or we can delve into them at the end of the discussion. So, about the Total War 3 Kingdoms campaign. Total War is all about decisive battles on an epic scale. The uniqueness of Total War is that in one moment you're looking at the campaign map, you're overseeing a vast empire, you're enacting laws, you hire characters into your followers, you build infrastructure, and you raise armies. But then these armies march into battle and you zoom in and you see your battalions marching over the battlefield, and you can zoom in even more and look into the faces of your soldiers as they go one-to-one with the enemy. And the campaign part in this is really about creating the interesting context for the battles. The campaign is where the narrative and the story of your campaign unfolds, usually over quite a few game sessions. Like a campaign can take 10 to 30 hours. And from a balancing point of view, this is really interesting because battles are much more short-term, much more constrained, whereas the campaign has to support a very long-term progression. Going through all these game sessions over long periods of time should give the players the feeling of, yeah, they're progressing towards something, they're achieving something. And without delving too deeply into the campaign as a whole, what would be good to understand is that there are usually a lot of factions on the campaign map. And these factions, they have to look after a lot of resources or metrics, like money, or there might be trade resources, there might be faction-specific resources, there's prestige. And these factions, they usually have a lot of characters and land or provinces that they own. And these provinces themselves, they have infrastructure and population, public order, taxation laws, and equally the characters, they have skill trees and loyalty and items, and the characters have relationships with each other. So all in all, it's a lot of highly interconnected systems. A relationship or a friendship of 2 of your generals and 1 of your armies might affect the local support in the province where that army is stationed. This increase might then lead to population growth, which then increases taxation income. So you typically have these long causal chains of cause and effect, and a lot of interactions between these systems. And that can create a lot of cool opportunities. Ideally, it's a very interesting strategic decision space where players can make rewarding and interesting decisions. And all the detail in the systemic interactions can help to deliver the immersion and create a believable world that seems realistic and authentic. So ideally, it's still easy to learn, but because of all these systemic connections, it's really hard to master and really rewarding to play with. But equally, there are some pitfalls as well. Because of all these systemic connections and interactions, it can be really unclear why things are happening. Like, okay, I have this problem here. That might be because I did this 10 turns ago or did that last turn. That can contribute to a sense of what we call the effect soup, that a lot of systems are impacted by a lot of other systems, and it's not really clear why and or how. And equally, exploits can be really sort of hard to detect in this interconnected systems, or equally, some systems might not actually be as impactful as you want and just be background noise. So in the end, in the worst case, it's really hard to learn and really hard to navigate through the jungle of systems, and then in the end it's super easy to master because it's actually quite simple. With these opportunities and pitfalls in mind, the balancing or the balancing intent is usually quite at the core of the high-level design of the game. Very early, when we develop a Total War game, we think about, okay, what are the important systems? Which systems should be the main drivers for the economy? How do these different systems interact with each other? And then also how does this perhaps change over the course of the campaign? Because this can be a strong driver for a sense of progression. If some systems maybe start to be not very important, but then over time they become more and more important. But I mean, this is all easy in theory and easy on paper, but there's really a lot of intuition involved. It's not like you can apply one formula which will sort out your balancing. It's a lot about intuition and experience, and this is where I come to the lessons learned. First of all, I want to talk about strategy. Total War is a strategy game. What is strategy? If you look it up, Google, it says a plan of action designed to achieve a long-term or overall aim. And more importantly, in comparison to tactics, tactics are the actual means used to gain an objective, while strategy is the overall campaign plan, which may involve complex operational patterns, activity, and decision-making that govern tactical execution. So in short, strategy is designing your overall long-term aim or objective, and tactics is the execution towards it. What does that mean in games? Strategy in games is usually a lot about planning ahead. Players should be, required to plan ahead and then also be rewarded for doing that well. There should be a sense of, okay, I can design my own way to play, my own design, define my own objectives, and then sort of reap the rewards of that long-term planning. And at the same time, adaptation is very important. That players will have to, as they go through a campaign, have to adapt their strategy and react to the environment and what their opponents are doing. And when we look back at Total War and Total War Three Kingdoms in particular, we felt like really it sometimes seems more like a tactical game and not really like a strategy game. And there was a huge outcry in a room full of developers when this first was brought up. But if you ask yourself, okay, does long-term planning really make a big difference? Are you able to formulate your own long-term strategic goals and reap the rewards for doing this really well? And often the answer is no. But it's not all doom and gloom, and I brought a little video to illustrate a little bit what I mean with that. Here we go.
This is a horse pasture, ladies and gentlemen. A very unique little building. There are only 4 regions in the entirety of China which can build horse pastures. There's one here, a second one there, a third one there, and finally a 4th one is situated right over here, the other side of the mountains. And it is going to be our mission to collect those horse pastures. And you might be wondering, look, Spiff, okay, why do you want to collect the horse pastures? The Qiang horse units are already 15% cheaper. How much cheaper can they get, and why would you want a horse pasture? Well, that's because horse pastures are very unique. As we can see, just having one of them reduces the recruitment cost of cavalry units by -5% and the upkeep of cavalry units by -5%. However, at the final level, it reduces the cost by 20%, meaning the upkeep of our horses and our Qiang cavalry is reduced by not only -15%, but it's increased to actually -35%. Quite good indeed, almost half the upkeep. However, if you then pick up this horse plantation here, and this horse plantation over here, and then finally this one over here, you might notice that suddenly you've stacked 4 times the 20% discount on horses, meaning horses are 80% cheaper to purchase and 80% cheaper to maintain. Well, this is where things can get very awry, because you can also decrease it even further, ladies and gentlemen. I know. You see, down here in the tech tree with barded mounts, the recruitment cost for cavalry sinks even more into -8, and you've also got hierarchical enforcement, and that's where you can have an extra army and all of your units go down 10% in terms of upkeep. So yes, today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be demonstrating to you how you can give yourself a completely free army, and by goodness is it fantastically fun.
Well, this is an absolutely excellent video by Spiffing Brit. Definitely recommend checking it out. And you can imagine when this video popped up in my feed a few months after release, I was like, oh god, what's going on? Everything's broken, basically. But when we looked at it, it's really that he designed and formulated a really interesting strategic goal: unlimited horses, or very cheap to maintain and effective cavalry armor forces. And for that, he had to formulate sort of a sequence of strategic sub-goals. Like, okay, he has to capture a certain set of key locations, expand the infrastructure to certain levels, which requires researching a certain set of technologies, and he has to have the right characters in key positions of the government. All of that for profit and reaping the rewards of it. Sounds like a really cool strategy. So we knew there is strategy in Three Kingdoms, but the question is it good enough? And to discuss this, I want to introduce 3 terms around sort of strategic decision making in games, which is the strategic decision space, strategic exploitation, and strategic momentum. The strategic decision space is basically about the variety of strategic goals and objectives you can define. Super easy example is from Civilization, where you have different victory objectives and you can decide which one to go for. But even in a game with a single victory objective, you might have certain ways towards that goal, like dominating a certain area of trade or focusing on specific military customization or quality over quantity. So in the end, it's about how you want to play or how you want to win the game. A good other example is in an action RPG, this would be the number of viable builds that you have. Strategic exploitation is then about how there are synergies between achieving multiple strategic goals. A very good example are the Paradox games, who usually do this really well, where mastering certain subsystems will create strong synergies, and it's almost required to build these synergies to be really successful at the game. Another cool example is from Slay the Spire, where the items you find or purchase synergize really well with your deck of cards. So as your character progresses throughout the playthrough, if you really focus and leverage on these synergies, you can have a really nice, rewarding feeling of power growth. And a nice old school example is the Diablo 2 skill tree, where the skills will have synergies with each other to further boost sort of the effectiveness of a build. And then finally, strategic momentum is about the impact of your decisions, both in terms of sort of the magnitude of the impact, but also the time over which this impact lasts and affects the game. A good example is Battlestar Galactica Deadlock, where you jump your fleets around sectors, but every time you want to jump again, you have to pay a penalty and extra fuel, and only if you stay in a position, this penalty will go down. So each time you decide to jump, that's a sort of a very heavy decision. That's a decision which will have an impact on your strategy. And ideally, games should provide you the opportunity to exploit this momentum as well. Again, referring to the Paradox games, where if you plan to do something really big like a world conquest, you know that, okay, actually over the centuries, effectively, I have to really build up my synergies between the systems and almost sort of very slowly but effectively snowball. So looking at Total War generally, but Three Kingdoms specifically, it's easy to identify three main problems. So first of all, the strategic decision space is quite narrow. There's really only one way to win. There's really only one, maybe 1.5 ways to build your economy. And militarily speaking, even though there's a lot of customization in the units you can recruit, there isn't really sort of a strong sense of focusing on one part of the military over the other, or you can't really go for quality over quantity. Secondly, even though there are a lot of synergies, they're often quite soft, which is again referring to the notion of effect soup, where there's a lot of ways to impact certain systems from various subsystems around, but each individual synergy doesn't really feel very rewarding. And then finally, somewhat related, is that often individual decisions don't really matter as much, especially over long periods of time. And one of the multiple examples for this in Three Kingdoms is the tech tree, where it's typically quite sprawling. There are a lot of technologies to research in the game, but there aren't really a lot of strategic goals, and we found that players don't really go towards certain key technologies and try to build a strategy around it. And it's more about picking and choosing in that moment when you unlock a new tech. Oh, okay, what do I need now? And you have a more balanced growth throughout the tech tree. And that can be absolutely fine. In fact, we can discuss this a bit further down the line at the end. But in fact, it was intended to be that way. But what we found is that a lot of systems on campaign side share this sort of sprawliness and the effect soup, which I think, is a little bit of a problem. So what are the lessons learned from this? It's a good question. First of all, of course, when we discovered this or formulated the fact that maybe there is a lot of tactics but not as much strategy, we thought first reaction was, okay, let's definitely make Total War really like hardcore strategy game, bring back strategy into Total War. But would that be such a good thing? I'm sure all of you played chess, and chess on an amateur level is usually played as a tactical game. You think about your current move, maybe you plan 1 move ahead, 2 moves, 3, 4 moves ahead, but it's really only on a professional level, or if you're really good at chess, that you can see it as a strategic game and plan ahead long periods of time and sort of forecast, okay, my opponent is going for this strategy. And there's a good reason why when you play paradox games, that even after 100 hours, you're still considered pretty much a noob in the game, because strategy is really, really hard. So for us, it's not necessarily about bringing a lot of heavy strategy elements in the game, but really formalize design around it and be really certain where we are on that spectrum between tactics and strategy. So what I would recommend everyone working on a strategy game is to really think about where you want to be on that spectrum, and maybe where different systems meant to be. I mean, as we discussed, it's a fine if a single system is maybe more on the tactical side, but what is the overall strategic decision space in your game meant to look like, and how does it look like? Because keeping it player friendly is really important, not just in terms of accessibility and keeping players engaged, but it also helps to make decisions a bit more rewarding. Normally tactical decisions, because you see the impact directly, are a bit more rewarding, and not stretching out over long periods of time. One second. Coming to the second section, gut fun first. And there's a little sort of fun story about that. Almost about a year ago, late in development of Three Kingdoms, our game director was sitting behind me in the office, and he was playing the game and turned around and, "Hey, Live." I was like, "Yeah, what's up?" And he said, "Yeah, So the effects for this building here, they're still very meh. And in fact, he used a much clearer expression of how he felt about these effects, but let's call it meh. It was this building here, the government support building chain in the residential district. And I think at the time it provided like 5% extra peasantry income for each level and some other effects. And I tried to explain to him that this was perfectly balanced. That increasing these effects would mean that the building would be way too strong, and in the grand scheme of things, this would be the right balance for the building. And we continued to discuss and went out to the parking lot even to discuss further. And but I guess the main point here is it doesn't really matter if things are perfectly balanced. If it feels meh, it probably is meh. So I guess the main point here being strategy games are always very good at providing the cerebral fun. You know, thinking things through, building your strategies, or enjoying the tactical decisions, and seeing your plans, you know, becoming successful as you go. And that's important, of course, for strategy games. That's makes them unique. But the gut fun is still very important. The emotional fun from just basically subconsciously enjoying the game. So the typical approach to balancing that people and designers talk about it, it's often about, yeah, let's try to avoid exploits. Let's try to basically constrain the player within the sort of playing field that we have in mind. So it's more about restricting the player rather than enabling. And that's what I would like to promote here a bit more, is to see balancing as an act of enabling the player, enabling cool decisions and rewarding decisions. So this plus 2% replenishment bonus here from this technology might be perfectly balanced for the game, but it doesn't feel very rewarding. And now you might say, okay, well, don't make a big deal of it, just add a 0, make it 20%, feels much more impactful, right? But that's unfortunately not how it works. Just cranking up the numbers might work in some cases, but in others might literally break the game or create more problems than it solves. And that's why it's really important to keep the gut fun in mind in the very early system design. When you think about how systems should interact, you need to enable these rewarding decisions right from the start. The emotional response to the balancing and the systemic interactions is really important. And a few free-to-play games or the clicker idle games do this really well, and it makes sense because the game is essentially just about the economy and seeing that progress and build up and grow. But other games do that really well as well. Anno 1800 is a good example, where what I would call the diagonal progression, where you start with a limited set of resources, and this can really spiral out of control in terms of numbers. But by adding additional resources into the production chains, you make sure that the system as a whole is still, you know, in a good place, and it doesn't spiral out of control easily. Another cool example is from this city builder here. I forgot the name now. Apologize. But it's really cool, where you have you know, in the beginning of the game you build a lumberjack hut, and it costs like 5 lumber. But then as you progress through the game, you look at your building options and you see a church that costs 1,000 lumber and 500 stone. You're like, oh wow, will I ever get there? And once you get there, it's a really rewarding choice. And equally, Riot always advocates its design philosophy that every item, every ability should be really meaningful and feel rewarding to use. Last year I was speaking to some designers from Blizzard, and we talked about design principles, and they said one of their design principles is make it OP, make it overpowered. And that's definitely something that would be cool to bring in more into strategy games. In the typical angles, they're already there. Typical angles for this in strategy games is usually providing unlocking units, unlocking buildings, unlocking game options, and overall focusing on that sense of progression. And big numbers or big changes can work as well, which is a purely numerical game, but it still helps, and we talked about that. And then finally, synergies between systems, giving players the ability to identify maybe slightly hidden synergies, but they are really rewarding to find and then to exploit. And elements of this is certainly present in Three Kingdoms. We have unit unlocks, diplomatic options are unlocked over time. And we've seen with the unlimited horse example from Spiffing Brit that you can design these really rewarding strategies as well. But we felt like overall, it's sometimes everything is a bit hidden. And even the unit unlocks, even though you do unlock a lot of units, these unlocks don't necessarily feel as rewarding as even in some previous Total War games or in other games, because they don't make as much of a difference on the battlefield. So the lessons learned here definitely to put the gut fun first when we design the systems, when we design the content, to think more about not just the cerebral fun from interacting with the game and its systems, but also about the gut fun and the emotional, like rewarding feeling. And if you think about it, a lot of strategy games like Civilization do that for decades now. In Civilization, when you have an early settlement, you might produce 3 hammers, so your temple takes 10 turns to build. Whereas later on, your cities provide hundreds of hammers, and a temple takes a single turn to build. So this progression-based system design is really important to push further. And with that comes the economic scaling. Seeing the numbers go up is inherently really rewarding. And then finally, something that we started with Three Kingdoms to some extent is gating in whole new features. We talked about the diplomatic options that are unlocked, but also some government positions and some other options that come in as the player plays the game. And that ties back into we discussed earlier with the importance of providing a sense of progression in the campaign balancing. That if you start your campaign, you should get a different feel playing it compared to when you're in, I don't know, after 2 weeks, you're in 20 hours, and it should feel like, oh, okay, I've really progressed into something. A moment. Coming to the final big lesson learned about embracing the polish phase. It's always, no matter if you're developing a professional game, if you're working on a side project, if you're working for a project at uni, it's often the difficult part is at the end when everything is already there to keep the focus up and keep the motivation up to really hammer it out and make it like a diamond basically. And that's always like that. And there's a interesting story about one of our designers who worked on the diplomacy system, did a brilliant job there. And as some of you might know, diplomacy was one of the major feature revisions, one of the major rewrites we did for Three Kingdoms. So it was really important to get that right, and the feature went through a lot of scrutiny, especially at the end of the project, where we had to iterate quite a bit. And one day he sends out an email saying, the database table with the diplomacy options already has 40 revisions. How many more are needed to finalize it? And of course, that's a emotional problem, and it's a leadership challenge, so to speak. But it's also interesting from a balancing point of view, because obviously at the end of your project, you will have limited time. And you need to think about, okay, how do I spend that time? How do I gain the most from the time spent? And as a baseline for this, I would sort of make the assumption that balancing is never good enough. If you think about the most polished games out there, they're usually very polished at their core. One of my favorite examples is Dark Souls, where the core combat is super polished. And it doesn't really matter that there are some balancing problems around maybe certain builds or certain weapons. What makes sort of the core of the game is fantastic. And also the assumption that the biggest gains you will usually have at the end, when everything is in place, when the so-called feature complete, that's when you will have the best visibility over your game, and you can make the most informed decisions about where to polish, how much. And you might say now, okay, hold on. I mean, how do you know that you're not turning in circles, like just trying to, improve and improve and improve? And in fact, in German, we have this term verschlimmbessern, which basically means you're trying to improve here and there and over there, and at the end, you end up with something worse than you started with. I think that's where it's important to treat the whole polishing and balancing process not like a speedboat, where you can, change direction and jump around and, at the end of the project decide to, okay, I'm going to totally change which of the systems is the most important one. Instead, treat it more like an oil tanker, where it's really important to know your bearing, where do you want to go, and then put all your effort into steering the ship very slowly but decisively into the right direction. And in fact, there's another German term which can help a little bit here, which is Schwerpunkt, which is a term of military strategy, which says it's about the concentration of one's force at a point where a decision can be gained. It's basically really focusing on where you make the most gains to increase the quality of the game. And for that, it's really important to acquire the right amount of information, have the right intel, understand and analyze where you are in the best way possible, then identify the core issues, and then focus on the critical fixes. And in a way, that's somewhat producer 101, but the crux is the execution in practice. And there was one sort of tool that we came up with and formalized during Three Kingdoms, which helped us a lot in this. And for that, I have to take one step back and talk about the fact that Total War is really about being a story generator in a historical setting. It's about telling your story, either reliving history or creating your alternative history. And especially with Three Kingdoms, we really wanted to push that forward. We wanted to create a game where the characters and the connections between these characters create interesting and immersive stories that are compelling and have a sense of drama. So how do we assess that? And what we came up with, or the process that we formalized, was what we called this playthrough story feedback, where basically our QA engineers and our designers, they played the campaign and made a little story, wrote down a little story of what happened in their game. It's what our fans are already doing quite a lot, the after action reports, really cool stuff out there. And that helped us to really look at, what's the story that's coming out of this? And for that, we had a clear intent. What does a good story mean? So there needs to be drama and suspense. But in the end, it's about, is it worth talking about? This is something where you would go to work the next day and tell your colleagues, oh wow, I played this amazing campaign in Three Kingdoms, and can you imagine Cao Cao betrayed me at the end, betrayed the alliance, or one of my best generals betrayed me. So this is worth talking about. And what's really important here is that the experience means much more than function. So experience over function. It's not really important if it works perfectly, if the resulting experience is really awesome and rewarding. Good example for this is the infamous Kongrong Food Monopolist playthrough by one of our QA engineers who played as Kongrong, and he tried to be a pacifist. Like, don't use military, or use it as least as possible. Instead, he focused on food trade, and specifically trading food to other factions and receive land in exchange. And specifically focus on trading their food producing regions for food, essentially building up a monopoly. And that's how he won the game. And that was an amazing story. Little caveat here that a few months after release, we actually had to address this somewhat and had to patch this to some extent, because our community found ways to crank this up basically to 11 and really break the game with it. But as a concept, I think it's a good example for how experience is more important than function. And another example here is, or was, the road to the end game, which caused a bit of trouble during development. And here we applied basically the Schwerpunkt and really looked closely at just, okay, how in your campaigns, how do players get into the end game? And we looked at the economy. Was it maybe too loose? Was it too easy to get a lot of money? We looked at the AI performance. Was the AI maybe struggling to play the game? Because what we wanted to achieve was sort of the namesake three kingdoms. We wanted power blocks to be forming. It's still a sandbox, so it wasn't meant to be always the same three kingdoms. But we really wanted to have these power blocks forming, and power blocks forming as oppositions to the player. So we looked at diplomacy as well, and in the end we discarded a lot of apparent problems, maybe where you think, oh, it's probably the economy, or it's probably the AI performance. But in the end, it turned out to be a bug in the diplomacy system and in the analysis of players who have a lot of vassals, which essentially meant that the AI wouldn't really understand this player as a threat. So by looking very closely at sort of the confined problem space and looking very closely at what the issues actually are, we're able to narrow it down to a few selected fixes that change the experience fundamentally. So to summarize this, it's really important to acquire the right amount of the right intel and the right information, and to find the right forum to do exactly that. Every game will require a different way of understanding and analyzing where you are late in development. And for us in Three Kingdoms, that meant focusing on these playthrough stories. Does the game generate stories that are worth telling? And from that, we focused on identifying the core issues to that experience, the example here with the endgame challenge, and then focus on the critical fixes to that, which is usually the easiest part of these three. So the lessons learned here really being to embrace the polished face. There's sometimes maybe the idea that it's not really required, it shouldn't be required. You should just develop your project, and then at the end it just falls into the right place. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. It's really important to embrace that phase, but to do it smartly. And for that, the absolute basic foundation is to have a clear intent. You really need to know of what is the experience you want to generate for players. And then from there, find the right forum to get analysis on that. Does the game deliver this experience you want to create? And then in all of that, focus over the experience over the function. The experience you generate is much more important than if everything is functioning well. So coming to the main takeaways. First of all, 1 + 1 = 3. Wasn't really my idea for the title, so I feel obliged to explain it a little bit. First of all, we talked about 3 lessons learned. Okay, but more importantly, 1 + 1 = 2 wouldn't be good enough. A game is meant to be more than the sum of its pieces, and that's where balancing can really shine and sort of generate these synergies between systems and make it really rewarding. And then finally, balancing not necessarily an exact science. Like we discussed, there's a lot of intuition, experience involved, and ultimately you won't be able to do it alone and figure it out just by yourself, working on your formula in your head. You need a lot of high quality feedback from various people. To get to the actual takeaways, especially if you work on strategy game projects or in strategy games in general, definitely try to remember to put gut fun first. In strategy games, the cerebral fun is usually already there, but focusing on the gut fun and focusing on the emotional satisfaction from interacting with the game is really important. In terms of balancing, focusing on enabling instead of restricting, not just focusing on, okay, let's try to avoid exploits, let's try to not anti-steamrolling, players must not steamroll. Instead, these things are still very important, but instead also focus on enabling cool strategies, enabling cool decisions, satisfying ways to play the game. And then again, specific for strategy games, where are you on the spectrum between tactics and strategy? What are the cool strategies you want to enable? And how does it work? Like, which systems do interact with each other on the way to these strategies? And finally, embrace the polished face, but be smart about it. Think about Schwerpunkt. Remember experience over function. And then finally, cannot be stressed enough. Build a strong QA team. Use them as sort of the laser sharp tools to analyze your game, and not just as testers who check if it functions. They can really help, and once you identify the right forum for your analysis, and really help to provide that high quality feedback. So, thanks very much. That's it from my side so far. And watch this space for future BAFTA game tutorials. Also, please have a look at the Creative Assembly website. We're currently hiring various design positions. So, yep, have a look and please apply if you're interested. So, definitely still some time to discuss questions. If you have any, please post them in the chat. There's also another example for the first whole section about strategy versus tactics that I brought with me is the tech tree again, and I think it's worth comparing Total War games somewhat. And this is the tech tree from Shogun 2, previous Total War game released in 2012, and it's a fairly simple layout. Each technology typically took quite a while to research, and especially these lower ones at the end of each branch. They're quite a commitment. So going for these was really a commitment and a strategic goal on its own. By the end of the campaign, you might have 2 or 3 of them. You couldn't go for all of them. So deciding which one to go for had a fundamental impact on your campaign. They usually unlocked either significant units or significant buildings. So you could decide to go for Matchlock Samurai, and then you can build your armies around having Matchlock Samurai units. And you might have to compensate for the fact that you don't have the strongest cavalry unit, or you have to compensate for the fact that you miss out on some economic bonuses. Or equally, you focus on the right side of the tech tree, focus on the economic bonuses, and then you're essentially playing for quantity over quality. The Three Kingdoms tech tree, on the other hand, is designed very differently. It's much more sprawling. There are overall way more technologies, typically take less time to research, and as a consequence, each of the effects from these technologies is a bit less significant. So you have a lot of more decisions to make, each less impactful. And like I said earlier, what we found is that players don't really go for strategic goals in their tech tree because they found that there isn't really much rewarding long-term goals to go for. Instead, it's more about picking and choosing as you go, and sort of a more harmonious growth in the tech tree. And in a way, this is sort of in line with the high-level design of the tech tree. This is from the original high-level design document from 2017, where we said, okay, reforms and methods, that's how the tech tree is called in the game, are a way for a faction to keep the balance within the wuxing, which is the sort of elemental categorization in the game. It is less about specialization, but more about balancing governance and nurturing the tech tree as a whole. Tipping this balance in favor of one or few elements is a dangerous game, but can be beneficial. So yeah, even though we achieved this high level design intent, there's still some problems from a strategic point of view in that the tech tree doesn't really um, help players to design valuable strategic goals in their campaigns. Okay, old school. Yeah, so this is a very interesting one. How does narration fit in systemic games? Um, I think a lot of strategy games, possibly because of that focus on cerebral fun and satisfaction, um, they can sometimes feel a bit dry, or for many people, they do feel a bit dry. Um, Personally, when I'm at home playing a game, my partner would come into the room and see me play Total War when I'm on the campaign map, and she would say, "You're playing the mappy game again." So I think it's really an interesting challenge to get a bit more soul and narrative into these games that rely a lot on seeing and thinking through the systemic interactions. But that being said, I think it's a Total War is, I like to believe it's quite successful at doing exactly that. That basically through this level of immersion and giving, like, easing in players into this historical world, um, there's a lot of opportunity for storytelling. And I think it's a very good sign that our community, Total War Center, has a lot of these, writes a lot of these after action reports, essentially stories or alternate histories inspired by their playthroughs. Um, and of course, then you have the whole topic of sort of narrative driven by systemic interactions. That's usually sort of the ambient storytelling, the emergent storytelling coming through the systemic interactions, which we tried to explore a lot in Three Kingdoms with the relationship system, where characters can build friendships and or become rivals, which would drive a lot of this emergent storytelling. Um, but one lesson learned for us there is it's not good enough to just focus on the incidental sort of micro narrative, but it's important to embed these micro narratives like events or these friendships being formed into sort of narrative arcs, which is for us the next step in that. The other question, another question here. One of our viewers has just finished Global Game Jam over the weekend. Any advice for achieving balance and getting the excitement curve in a game jam environment? I think it's a brilliant example of experience over function. Like balancing, like in a quick environment when you need to come up with a awesome, satisfactory balancing intent in short periods of time. It's really important on focusing on what you want to achieve, what are the core elements of the experience, and then focusing on getting that right. If you can break it left and right, and when players maybe play the game for the fifth time, they see or find this exploit here that might break the game. It's not as, I mean, would be nice to avoid, right? But I think it's important to get that first experience right. What's your favorite part of the game that you've worked on yourself? Um, I really enjoy sort of the civic management side of Total War and Three Kingdoms specifically, building up your provinces, taking care of your government, filling in the positions in the government. I think it's a very nice. I'm personally quite happy with sort of the level of immersion, the balance between authenticity and rewarding decisions. Even though, as we discussed, there are some problems around it, but I think I'm personally quite happy about it. How much can tools help balancing when it comes to strategy games? Like you got power curves or something in other genres. Are there things you can make use of for this? Definitely. We usually have a two-pronged approach to this. First of all, basically starting from the intent, we usually try to model, or not usually, always, try to model as much about the game in a big Excel sheet, essentially, where there's some high-level simulation over the course of the campaign, how your economy will develop, how your population will grow, how public order will usually fluctuate. So there's sort of a high-level simulation that we use to get a good bearing about where we want to end up with and what is our intent, and sort of get a first good pass on the numerical values. But then on the other hand, we use a lot of AI runs. I think last month, Duygu and Chaba talked about AI analysis, and using that a lot for balancing the game is definitely really valuable and important. It's not the only tool that we use because obviously the AI playing the game against itself is different than the player actually, exploiting the game, always trying to min-max. But it's definitely a very valuable tool to get a lot of numerical data. And then, it is a lot about number crunching and looking at the sheets and seeing, okay, on average, the AI has way too many armies after turn 120, so we need to do something about it. And then finally, I think qualitative feedback is really, really important, as we said earlier. Really making sure that you have a strong QA team that can give you this quality feedback and not just looking at numbers. Do alternate realistic history have a place in Total War? What's the limit? One of the core pillars of Total War is historical authenticity, but another core pillar is also that it's a sandbox. So our paradigm is usually the starting situation where players jump into the game should be authentic, should feel, like the real world in history that you would find if you would go back. But then from there, it's really down to the player's actions, and we normally, through balancing systemic interactions, we normally try to make sure that it sort of progresses in historical in a historical direction. But it's really important to still give the player the option to deviate from that potentially quite a lot. But a very good example here is from Rome 2, where there was initially a bit of disappointment that Rome wouldn't really become a major antagonist for a player faction, and that was something that was improved over time, and which always reminds us that yes, it's still important that sort of the big hitters of the historical period are present, or the big events that they do happen. Have you got any stories of breaking the game through strategic exploitation yourself? I think Total War does a pretty good job of avoiding that. I mean, plenty of stories. Hopefully they were all fixed and patched out before release. There were huge problems around administration cost or corruption. But it was, one cool story was basically to have a lot of administrators in the right provinces and focus a lot on building the Jade Seal archives, which reduces corruption, which then resulted in the economy spiraling out of control in a rewarding way, but in a broken way. So that had to be fixed. Yeah. I think I did address all questions. So thanks very much for tuning in. I hope it was interesting, and like I said, stay tuned for further BAFTA games tutorials from CA and other parties, and make sure to check out the Creative Assembly website for our job applications. Thank you.